I'm becoming a new person now. I guess I'm 31. It's time to grow up a little bit. But thanks for being here today. We are in week 2 of our series, Searching for a King. So in this series, we're talking about our King, who is Jesus. And if I had one summary statement to summarize this 3-week series that we are in, it would be this: King Jesus governs the church by providing a law that equips his church or his people to participate in his redemptive work globally. So King Jesus governs, he rules over his church by providing a law that equips his church to participate in his redemptive work globally. So last week, in the first week of this series, if you missed it, that title, that message is Jesus is King. And we talked about how Jesus reigns as king and how a king has a people, a rule, a law, and land. And so we broke down the idea of Jesus as king in comparison to other narratives of kingship that we hear in this world, or perhaps even in the church at times. This week, we are going to unpack the law of King Jesus. If we are followers of Jesus and we call him king, what is the law that we follow? What is the shape of his kingdom? And next week, we are going to talk about his church. Who are his people? And we're going to talk about his vision globally for all of the land. So those two concepts will be next week. But this week, we are going to focus in on the law of Jesus. How is Jesus shaping us? Who is he shaping us to become? And for us to gain an understanding of this, we are actually going to take a moment and go all the way back to the Old Testament in the book of Deuteronomy. And in the book of Deuteronomy, chapter 6, verses 4 through 5, we find something called the Shema. This was a Jewish statement that the Jewish people would say in the morning and the evening and different parts of the day as well. They would face Jerusalem and they would say this statement out loud. And this statement acknowledged who their God was, but it also shaped them as a people. It's from this: Deuteronomy chapter 6, verses 4 through 5 says, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You must love the Lord your God with your whole mind, your whole being, and all your strength." How many of you would say that you do a good job of keeping a routine? Like you keep a routine. Anybody here, you're good at keeping a routine? Okay, I see some hands here and there. Some of us, we struggle to keep a routine. I was never really into routines, and then we had a baby. And I figured if I want to prioritize some things, I have to have a bit of a routine for my life. So every morning I get up at around 4:30 or 5 a.m. And I spend my time reading scripture. I spend my time, if I can, working out. I prepare breakfast for Clark and myself as well. And sometimes Kim, but she usually doesn't want to eat what we're eating, so I allow her to get her own breakfast. But I have this whole routine. And it really gets messed up when Clark wakes up early. He needs to sleep in so that I can, take care of my routine. And if my routine gets thrown off, I'm a little bit out of whack for the day. I have to, refocus myself a little bit. I don't like when my routine is off. I actually really like this now. But for a season of my life, I did not have a routine. And because of that, my life was chaos. I remember back before I was dating Kim, I would stay up till 1, 2, 3 a.m., and then I would sleep in till like 11 or 12, and then I'd be like, oh, there's no time in the day. I can't get anything done. Well, it's like, Scott, because you're sleeping half of the day. And I was staying up most of the night. I can't get anything done, and, just always spending time with people and not really being productive. And then every once in a while, as much as I love this routine, this disorganized, chaotic Scott comes back into my life. So for example, back in January, Kim and Clark, they were down in Mississippi for Kim's job, and I was like, oh, I'm just going to live the bachelor life now, and I was sleeping in. I wasn't taking care of the house. I remember one morning, I must have had a nightmare or something, and the bed sheets were all over the place, so I sent Kim a photo, and I said, I'm taking good care of the house, don't you worry. And I think she thought it was funny, but everything was just a mess, and I got out of my routine, so my life was out of sorts. Things were a little chaotic. I didn't feel like myself. Sometimes we war against a routine, but whether you're shaped by your routine or not, you might then instead be shaped by chaos and disorganization. And the Jewish people, they had this routine of saying this statement aloud every day. Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. You must love the Lord your God with your whole mind, your whole being, and all your strength. This statement, this declaration was not just something they said. This was a routine, a daily routine, multiple times a day that shaped them as a people. It reoriented their lives to focus on God and not on themselves. And then Jesus does something really interesting with this statement. As he begins to shape a law for his followers, as he continues on the story that God has been telling all throughout the Old Testament, Jesus reshapes the Shema. As in the words of my professor, Dr. McKnight, he calls this the Jesus Creed. And this Jesus Creed is the law that I believe should shape followers of King Jesus. If we claim he is king and we claim we are following him, we must allow this to shape us. Check this out in Mark chapter 12, starting in verse 28. A religious leader says to Jesus, "Which commandment," he asked, "is the first one of all?" "The first one," replied Jesus, "is this: Listen, Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your understanding and with all your strength. And this is the second one. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. No other commandment is greater than these ones." I've heard it said before that you could take all of the teaching of Jesus, and it falls under this ethic of love God and love others. And all of the teaching of Jesus in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John is actually teaching us how to love God and love others. It can all be seen through that framework. This is the law of Jesus. So Jesus here does something interesting, though. He takes Deuteronomy 6 and he adds to it. Now, where does this come from? This second commandment, love your neighbor as yourself. For those of you who read the Bible through a year every year and you successfully make it through, you might recognize that this second commandment that Jesus adds to the Shema is actually from the book of Leviticus. I know some of us get to Leviticus and we say, I can't do this anymore. I don't know. I can't follow right now. But there's some really important stuff in Leviticus, especially this. Check this out, Leviticus 19:18. You must not take vengeance or bear a grudge against any of your people, but you must love your neighbor as yourself. I am the Lord. So Jesus combines Deuteronomy 6 and Leviticus 19 to form and shape a law for his people. This is the ultimate law, the ultimate ethic and shaping of King Jesus for us. That we would be people who love God and love others. The law of King Jesus is simply that, to love God and love others. That's the law of King Jesus. We can get caught up in our debates and our disagreements and have our opinions and our voices and have discussions, but if it ever corrupts loving God and loving others, then we are allowing another law to have a primary focus in our lives above the law of Jesus. We can have these moments where we speak up and say something and listen to others, but if we start to have within us a heart of division or a heart of self-righteousness or a predisposition to, oh, I'm right and they're wrong, what is happening is we could be allowing something else to creep in that is shaping us, not the creed of Jesus, which is to love God and love others. So this brings up an interesting question. You might be asking, how exactly do I love God? What does that look like? Because love is a powerful word, but at the same time, love is a word that we just loosely throw around. I know I'm guilty of this. I say things like, I love ice cream. I do love ice cream. In fact, when I was in Greece, I loved gelato. I had gelato every single day. It was so good. I just want to go back and have some more. And then when I was in Texas, I got to go to Buc-ee's, and I love Buc-ee's, and I got to have peanut butter fudge. But it's a different kind of love. Maybe should better say I enjoy peanut butter fudge from Buc-ee's. If you don't know what Buc-ee's is, I'm sorry, you're missing out on life. It's a gas station. And you're like, a gas station? Not what you think. Anyway, you can look it up later. But we just throw this word love around very loosely. Oh, I love this, I love that. But the type of love for God that we see demonstrated by Jesus and that Jesus calls us to, this is a different level of love. This is a different kind of love. Think of the type of love that you might have for your closest family and friends. The type of love where you say, I would do anything for them. I would sacrifice. I would go out of my way for them. This is a different type of intimate love. And there's an interesting expression of this in a story found in Luke chapter 9. Now, the word love is not used in this story. But I do believe that as we look at this story closely, Jesus is calling this man to a life of loving God over loving his tradition. Check this out, Luke chapter 9. To another person he said, "Follow me." "Master," he replied, "let me go and bury my father." "Let the dead bury their dead," said Jesus. "You must go and announce God's kingdom." Now, in most of the gospel stories, you're like, man, I wish I could be more like Jesus. But every once in a while, you come across a text like this one. And if you read through it quickly, you're like, I don't know exactly what's going on here. Jesus doesn't seem like himself, so I'm just going to keep reading and go to the next thing. I don't know if you've ever been there before. Like the one in Matthew chapter 15 when Jesus says to the woman about dogs eating from a table. It's like eating scraps from a table. At first, you're like, what's going on there? In this one, Jesus is talking to a man who wants to go bury his father, and Jesus says, yeah, let the dead go bury their own dead. At first, you're probably kind of like, at least if you're me, and this is kind of serious, Jesus. This man's father died. What's going on here? Well, it's helpful for us to gather a little bit of context here to see what exactly is going on here, to move beyond the surface. You see, in Jesus' world, burials took place in two stages. First, following the death of a father, the family placed the body in a casket and then into a tomb for the body to decompose. The family mourned for 7 days, and then the body decayed for about a year in the tomb. Secondly, after a year, the bones were taken from the tomb, placed in a box, and reburied for good. This was a way of honoring one's father. This was an act of loving God by following the Torah. Scholars believe that this man is approaching Jesus between the first and the second burial, so a year's time in between. He would not have left his family during the initial 7 days of mourning. So this is in that year-long gap in between. And Jesus is shaping and shifting and changing things up a little bit. Jesus is putting out a new idea here. Yes, this man has already had an opportunity to be with his family and mourn his father. This is between year 1 and year 2. Jesus is basically saying, hey, it's time to live again. Come follow me. You don't have to mourn for an entire year and just not really do anything. Come on into new life. Should he follow Jesus or follow the Torah? This is kind of the tension that comes up here. Should he follow Jesus or follow his tradition? Should he follow Jesus or keep doing everything his family expects him to do? Some of us have been there before in adulting, right? I'm trying to figure this out right now. I know Jesus is asking me to do this, but my family wants me to do this. What should I do right now? How do I say this in love and grace and humility? How do I handle this? What do I do here? This is a text about love for God. Are you willing to lay some things aside? Are you willing to sacrifice in order to follow Jesus? So I doubt your story is like this man's in Luke chapter 9 about a 1-year process for the fullness of a funeral. But there might be something else that you're saying to yourself right now. Should I follow Jesus or this? And I don't know what that is for you, but I imagine you know what it is. What is getting in between you fully following Jesus? You see, we love because he first loved us. And out of his love for us, what is keeping you from fully embracing and living in that love for God? Saying, I'm holding on to this thing. I'm holding on to this expectation from this group. I'm holding on to this tradition. I'm holding on. And what is keeping you from saying, I'm all in with Jesus and I'm going to live a life of love for Jesus? Often we will find that following Jesus will require surrendering familiarity and worldly security. But you know what? That's what Jesus demonstrated for us. He surrendered familiarity and security out of love for the sake of each and every one of us. John describes it this way in John chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word, that's Jesus. The Word was close beside God, and the Word was God. In the beginning, he was close beside God. All things came into existence through him. Not one thing came into existence without him. And the Word became flesh and lived among us. Jesus was in perfect Trinitarian unity with the Father and the Spirit in a place of familiarity and security, but the Son took on flesh. He became one of us and went to the point of death, yes, even death on a cross. He went from a place of familiarity and security and in an act of love expressed his love for us. And then oftentimes what we will find is that we are walking in a way to seek to love him. We have to move past that which is familiar. We have to move past worldly security that we wrap up our identity in. So what is getting in the way of you living a life of love for God? Which brings us to our next question. Who is my neighbor? Because Jesus places both of these ideas right next to one another. He says these are the priority, to love God and to love our neighbor. In fact, in 1 John, John's writing, and he's like, hey, if you don't love others, you don't really love God. We're like, whoa, John, that's kind of in your face. But there's a truth there. How we interact with others and love others is a reflection of how we understand God's love for us. How are we loving others? Who is my neighbor? And this question comes up in Luke chapter 10, when a man has a conversation with Jesus about the Jesus Creed. And they're going back and forth, and the man answers wisely. And then he tries to trip Jesus up. He said, yeah, but who is my neighbor? Have you ever done that with Jesus before? You felt like he clearly said something to you, but you kind of maybe wanted some wiggle room to get out of it, and you're like, yeah, but did you really say this? Is this really what you want? Is this really what's best? Did you really ask me to do that, or did you ask me to do this instead? Who is my neighbor? How do we shape this idea of being a neighbor? And then Jesus tells one of his most powerful stories in Luke chapter 10. Jesus replied with a story. A Jewish man was traveling from Jerusalem down to Jericho, and he was attacked by bandits. They stripped him of his clothes, beat him up, and left him half dead beside the road. By chance, a priest came along. But when he saw the man lying there, think about this, a priest, someone who should have been like, hey, let's help this man. But when he saw the man lying there, he crossed to the other side of the road and passed him by. A temple assistant, someone who worked in the temple, had proximity to God, a temple assistant walked over and looked at him lying there, but he also passed by on the other side. Pay close attention to Jesus' words here. Then a despised Samaritan came along. In Luke's gospel, Jesus is all about doing this. If you read Luke's gospel closely, Jesus loves to turn expectations upside down. A despised Samaritan. In Jesus' world, there was great hostility between the Jewish people and the Samaritans. Samaritans were somewhat viewed as half-breeds and outcasts, and Jesus is about to make a Samaritan a hero of the story. He does this. Read Luke's gospel closely. Jesus does this over and over and over again. Then a despised Samaritan came along, and when he saw the man, he felt compassion for him. Going over to him, the Samaritan soothed his wounds with olive oil and wine and bandaged them. Then he put the man on his own donkey and took him to an inn where he took care of him. The next day he handed the innkeeper 2 silver coins, telling him, "Take care of this man. If his bill runs higher than this, I'll pay you the next time I'm here." This Samaritan, this unlikely person, breaks across a social barrier of his time and says, I am going to care for this man. Jesus makes a Samaritan the hero of the story, a priest, a temple assistant. They both walk by. But this Samaritan steps in, and he cares for the man. He doesn't just care for him. He goes above and beyond. Takes him to an inn, offers to cover his bills. Jesus is framing and shaping what it looks like to be someone's neighbor. If you read enough leadership books, a lot of leadership gurus talk about this idea of placing trust in the gaps. What that means is, let's say you're a manager and you have some people on your team. Let's say you have someone on your team who's been working for you for years. But one day they come in late. They did not tell you they were going to be late, but they just showed up late to work. There is a gap at that moment between what happened and there's a gap between that person coming in late and the story that you now have. You can place in that gap trust or create your own story. You could put in that gap, hey, you know what? This person's been working for me for years. They've never come in late. They're responsible. Something serious must be going on. You could place that in the gap of the unknown. You could place trust there and say, I trust them. They've always been good to me. Or you could just come up with a really maybe you're having a bad day. I can't believe they come in late. They must be taking advantage. They've been working here for years now. They think they can do whatever they want. That's not placing trust in the gap. That's placing suspicion in the gap. And you start to assume things about a person before you even talk to them and say, hey, why did you come in late today? Have any of you done this before? Maybe not even with work, but just with your friends? So-and-so's late. Why are they not here right now? I just know. They were probably hanging out with somebody else. And you find out later, oh, no, they had a flat tire. Oh, now I feel bad. And they weren't able to tell me because their phone was dead. Oh, my goodness, I feel horrible. But there's this gap. And in that gap, you can choose to place trust there when you don't know the full story, or you can place suspicion there. Some of us, when we come across a story like this one in our everyday lives, we don't place trust in the gaps when we see an injured man like this one in the story. I'm not even saying somebody who's actually physically injured on the side of the road, although that may be the case. You might be interacting with somebody who's hurting, who's upset, who's angry, who's frustrated, and you don't know the full context for why. And you can place a story in that gap and start to assume things about the person and just move past them because of the story you're giving yourself, just like the priest and the temple assistant did in this story. Or you can say, hey, you know what? I need to be a neighbor to this person. But there are different stories and labels that we love to place based off of maybe how a person looks or talks. And those labels and stories give us an excuse to not be a neighbor to somebody. Stories like this. Oh yeah, they should have known better. We tell ourselves that when we know if somebody was hurting, or they did that to themselves. They should have known better. That they would figure out on their own. Or, oh, I heard about that. That group of people, oh yeah, those kind of people, they're always looking to take advantage. They love to play the victim card. Before you've even talked to them, you just heard about the situation. Or stories like this one. Those type of people, they are privileged. They don't know true suffering. I hope they get what they deserve. Whatever background or perspective you come from, it's so easy to place a story there in that gap, a story of suspicion without ever actually talking to that person or group. It gives us an excuse to say, who really is my neighbor? And do I have to be a neighbor to them? It may not be a story, but it might be a label that we give them. And because of that label, I can't help somebody like that. There's just no helping them. Labels like, oh, they're a Miami Dolphins fan. Oh, or a New York Jets fan. Oh, I just can't do it. I'm kidding. More serious labels. Labels like, oh, them, they're a Trumper. Or them, oh, they're a radical leftist. Oh, those people, oh, those Republicans, oh, those Democrats, oh, those illegals, oh, those people, oh, those privileged people, oh, these people, and all these labels that our world wants us to think, yeah, put that label in front of somebody else and then you don't have to be a neighbor to them. You can just judge them and keep your distance. But that's not what we're called to do. Look at Jesus' interaction with this guy after he tells the story of the Good Samaritan. Which of these three do you think turned out to be the neighbor of the man who was set upon by the brigands, the bandits? The one who showed mercy on him. Well, Jesus said to him, you go and do the same. The story and the label of neighbor for those who follow King Jesus supersedes all other stories and labels. Other people are our neighbor before anything else. And so we are called to love God, and out of our love for God, love them. I don't know if any of you grew up watching Mr. Rogers. I occasionally turn on Daniel Tiger or Mr. Rogers for Clark. Mr. Rogers actually asked a very profound question at the beginning of his shows. He did not ask the question, who is my neighbor? He looked at the camera and said, please won't you be my neighbor? That's the question we must ask as Christ followers with every person that we interact with. No matter what label the world tells us we should give that person, no matter what story the world tells us we should have about that person or that group, those who follow the law of King Jesus have a responsibility to look at people and say, please won't you be my neighbor? Please won't you be my neighbor? That is the heart and perspective of followers of King Jesus. And somebody else also gets to be a neighbor to you. It's this great cycle. Whereas we love God and love others, others will love us, and builds up this community called the church. You might be familiar with this passage from Weddings, 1 Corinthians chapter 13. The Apostle Paul writes this about love. He says, love is patient and kind. Love is not jealous or boastful or proud. It does not demand its own way. It is not irritable, and it keeps no record of being wronged. It does not rejoice about injustice, but rejoices whenever the truth wins out. Love never gives up, never loses faith, is always hopeful, and endures through every circumstance. Maybe you've heard this exercise before, but I always find it to be helpful. Take your name and place it where love is in this text and read it back to yourself and say, hey, how can I grow? In other words, Scott is patient and kind. Kind, maybe. I think some people would say that. Patient, I don't know. Scott is not jealous or boastful or proud or rude. I got to work there too. It does not demand its own way. It is not irritable, and it keeps no record of being wronged. It does not rejoice about injustice, but rejoices whenever the truth wins out. Scott does not give up, never loses faith, is always hopeful, and endures through every circumstance. Place your name in this text, 1 Corinthians 13, 4-7, and say to yourself, where can I grow and become more like Jesus? Because he himself is love. As followers of King Jesus, we love God and love our neighbor. That's simply it. The law of King Jesus is to love God and love others. Earlier this year, I shared with the church that our word for the year was create. So we've done some series around that word. We've engaged in different initiatives around that word. What does it mean for us as those who are created in the image of God to create space, to to listen to him, to become more like him, to do the things that he's called us to do? Here's my challenge for us today around that word create. My challenge is that you would create space to daily say the Jesus Creed out loud, maybe together as a family or by yourself. Say it in the morning when you wake up, and say it in the evening before you go to bed. And then throughout the day, whenever it comes to mind, say it. Over this past year, whenever I've had to deal with maybe some conversations that I was maybe intimidated by or not looking forward to, I have found myself saying the Jesus Creed before going into the meetings, and I found myself saying the Jesus Creed in my head during the meetings. And I can say this much: these words have a transformative power. Sometimes in our more Protestant world, we don't love the idea of repetition and saying things. Everything's supposed to be spontaneous and new and exciting. But I was talking to a friend of mine this past week, and he was sharing with me how he was ministering to somebody in his church who had dementia. And as he was ministering to this man had forgotten almost everything. But he looked at the man who was Catholic and had weekly said the Lord's Prayer. And he said to the man, hey, I'm going to say the Lord's Prayer over you. And before he could even speak, the man recited the Lord's Prayer. There's something powerful to repetition. Not just, this is stale, we do this every week, we do this all the time, we do this every day. Spontaneous can be good, but not everything. There's something to repetition that begins to shape our hearts and minds so that we become more like Jesus, and that which is repetitious begins to be that which shapes us, and then even in our darkest and lowest moments, that's what we remember. That's what we'll recall. So I want you to allow the Jesus Creed to be something that shapes your life. Some actually believe that the early church said the Jesus Creed daily and out loud. So this week on our YouVersion Bible app, if you follow us, every day this week, I'm not going to upload new scripture. Each day, I'm just going to upload the Jesus Creed. Every single day. And I'm going to upload it each day so you get a notification each day, not just on Monday. And my prayer is that this law of King Jesus would shape us as a church. So instead of ending and closing us in prayer today, we are going to end by reciting the Jesus Creed together, and then Aaron will come and close the service. But I'm going to invite you to repeat after me. There's something important about us saying this together as a church. We're not just doing this by ourselves. God has given us this community of people, the church. I'm going to read it through, and then I'll read it again and ask you to repeat after me, but just so you have some guidance. Listen, Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your understanding and with all your strength. And this is the second one. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Let today be the day that these words are not just words we read, but they begin to be words that shape us as people. They will shape us in our family conversations. These words will shape us in the workplace. These words will shape us in whatever situations we find ourselves in. May these words be words that shape us, that we have one God, and He is good. He looks like Jesus, and He is our King who is shaping us. And we will love our neighbor in a world that says, be hostile, point the finger, get angry, get upset. We will instead say, please won't you be my neighbor, and allow love of God to shape our love for neighbor. So repeat after me. Listen, Israel. The Lord your God, the Lord is one. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your understanding and with all your strength. And this is the second one. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. Amen.